you're on if the numbers come up.
I usually don't do it. We don't want to do a question and answer. Bring the microphone in.
Okay.
Okay, we appear to be at noon, so I'd like to welcome everyone here, both the folks who were able to attend in our auditorium and the folks watching live online or perhaps even later online. For all in attendance, for all viewing, we know why we're here today. The Game Commission made the announcement yesterday that a new free-ranging CWD positive deer was detected in Clearfield County in an area where we had only detected the disease previously in captive animals. So there are some implications there in terms of the Game Commission's response for what this means due to the proximity of that new CWD positive animal to the elk range. And what we intend to do today is provide some expert insight from the people on this panel, and I'll go ahead and introduce them. Starting at my far right is Rich Palmer. Rich is the Deputy Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Game Commission. Next to him is Andy Olson. Andy is a biologist with the Keystone Elk Country Alliance. We have Cindy Dunn, the Secretary of the State Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. Game Commission Executive Director Brian Burhans. Game Commission Wildlife Management Director Wayne LaRush. Game Commission Veterinarian Justin Brown. We have Deputy Secretary Greg Hostetter with the State Department of Agriculture, and next to him, Dr. Kevin Brightbill, Assistant Director of the Bureau of Animal Health and Diagnostic Services for the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. So we'll get started with opening comments from Brian Burhans.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's press conference. The purpose of this conference is to update you on new information on the status of chronic wasting disease within Disease Management Area 3. We will also provide you with a brief on our plans to continue our efforts in dealing with chronic wasting disease. The Pennsylvania Game Commission has been working closely with the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture on chronic wasting disease. We are very appreciative of the partnership with the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture and the expertise that they bring to help us deal with this critical issue. Dealing with chronic wasting disease must be a team effort, and we are grateful for the Department of Ag for being part of this team. Chronic wasting disease is an always fatal disease in deer and elk. The mere existence of chronic wasting disease in Pennsylvania represents a serious risk to our deer and elk herd, and hunting and conservation in the Commonwealth. Hunting in Pennsylvania is a $1.6 billion a year industry, and the license sales derived from deer hunters provide significant funding to allow the Pennsylvania Game Commission to conserve all 480 species of wild birds and wild mammals. As you may recall, chronic wasting disease was found in 2014 on 2 Jefferson County deer farms. Both farms were certified by the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. These diseased deer resulted in the Game Commission establishing Disease Management 3, per the 2011 Interagency Chronic Wasting Disease Response Plan. The establishment of a disease management area results in a variety of actions by the Pennsylvania Game Commission, including testing of roadkill and hunter-harvested deer, prohibiting the use of attractants such as deer urine, baiting, and feeding, and prohibiting the removal of high-risk deer parts from the disease management area. Since the establishment of the Disease Management Area 3, 1,012 roadkill and hunter-harvested deer have been tested for the presence of chronic wasting disease in Disease Management Area 3. All have tested negative. However, for the first time, chronic wasting disease has now been confirmed in free-ranging deer in Bell Township, or in a free-ranging deer in Bell Township, Clearfield County, which is located within Disease Management Area 3. This diseased deer was an adult buck. The deer was reported to the Game Commission by a member of the public because it was exhibiting symptoms of illness. The deer was euthanized by wildlife conservation officers and the deer was submitted for testing on June 7th. The fact that this animal was exhibiting clinical signs of the disease suggests that the animal had been infected for a prolonged period of time and likely was shedding prions for some time. This is the first case of chronic wasting disease in free-ranging deer found outside of Disease Management Area 2. The Pennsylvania Game Commission is now expanding our efforts to determine the extent of infection in Disease Management Area 3. The Pennsylvania Game Commission is the agency responsible for addressing chronic wasting disease in wild deer. As such, we have the responsibility to take the necessary actions needed to address the spread of chronic wasting disease to our wild deer herd and to our elk herd. Our hunters represent the first line of defense in helping us deal with chronic wasting disease. As part of our efforts, the Game Commission will make available 2,800 Deer Management Assistant Program permits, usually referred to as DMAP permits. These permits will be issued over and above the allocation of antlerless deer tags issued by the Game Commission for this wildlife management unit. Hunters can use DMAP permit to harvest a doe anywhere within Disease Management Area 3, within any hunting season open for deer, with landowner permission. These permits will be valid on both public and private lands. By issuing DMAP permits, we will be able to increase the likelihood of identifying other deer infected with chronic wasting disease within Disease Management Area 3. Identification of additional deer infected with chronic wasting disease is critical to allowing the Game Commission to identify specific areas where we will require more focus by the agency. We are calling on our hunters to help us. Hunters can help us by dropping off heads of harvested deer taken in the Disease Management Area 3 to drop-off locations so we can have these deer tested. We will be issuing a future press release that will identify these drop-off locations. Again, this effort is critical in helping the agency determine where other infected deer may exist within Disease Management Area 3. Deer are social, which suggests that nearby animals may have already been exposed. We must address this reality. In addition to expanding surveillance using DMAP permits, we will begin a localized, targeted shooting of deer in the immediate area where the diseased deer was found. We will use sharpshooters from the United States Department of Agriculture's Wildlife Services to accomplish this goal. These deer will be taken within a very small and defined area, specifically focused on the area where the diseased deer was found in June. This effort is critical if we are going to have any chance of keeping this disease from spreading to other deer in the area. All deer harvested that do not test positive for chronic wasting disease will be donated to local food banks. The Game Commission will also be holding public meetings in both Disease Management Area 3 and Disease Management Area 2 to update communities on our efforts and to gather input from our citizens. If we are going to have any chance at controlling this disease, we will need the support of our hunters, the public, and our partners in the legislature. Again, the Pennsylvania Game Commission's ultimate goal is to try to stop additional infection among free-ranging deer in Disease Management Area 3. There is still much unknown about controlling chronic wasting disease, but the methods we are proposing are the best options we have at this time, based on the results in Pennsylvania and other states dealing with chronic wasting disease. These efforts will not be inexpensive. Currently, the Game Commission invests almost $1 million annually in surveillance efforts in our disease management areas. We anticipate these costs will rise dramatically with the funding of this positive free-ranging deer in Disease Management Area 3. However, these investments are necessary and the right thing to do. Our success will impact the management of all wildlife in the Commonwealth today and for future generations.
Thanks, Brian. Cindy Dunn?
Thank you, Director Burhans. I'm here today to commit resources from the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources to this effort. We at DCNR fully support the approach, the robust effort being led by the Pennsylvania Game Commission and Pennsylvania Department of Ag. We recognize the severity of the issue and the concerns raised by Director Burhans. We at DCNR recognize the importance of both the white-tailed deer herd in Pennsylvania and the elk herd. White-tailed deer are Pennsylvania's mammal. When people think about Pennsylvania, when you think about the wildlands of Pennsylvania, the white-tailed deer is what comes to mind. It's a very important part of our culture, not just among hunters, but those who view wildlife as well, and among the 40 million people who visit the state parks every year, hoping for a glimpse of a white-tailed deer. It's very important. The white-tailed deer is very important to our Commonwealth's economy. Brian pointed out the hunting economy involved with white-tailed deer, but it's also an important part of the wildlife viewing economy and people who really like to travel Pennsylvania and see deer. Also, we at DCNR manage 2.2 million acres of state forest lands and 121 state parks. And 100% of the state forest land, except for safety zones, is available for hunting. And 80% of state park lands, something people don't fully realize, is available for hunting. So we view white-tailed deer hunting as an important element of our recreation in the state park and the state forest system across Pennsylvania. And we see this outdoor recreation as threatened and a concern due to chronic wasting disease. Now, turning to the Pennsylvania elk herd, elk are very near and dear to DCNR's mission. We operate a program called the Pennsylvania Wilds in partnership with DCD and the Game Commission and many other partners. But the elk story in Pennsylvania is one of the conservation success stories that we can really brag about in the state. When you think about the elk herd that was decimated in Pennsylvania, and by the late 1870s, our indigenous elk herd had been completely wiped out. And this was due to unregulated hunting and habitat loss, industrialization. But from 1913 to 1926, 177 elk from Yellowstone National Park and some private reserves were brought to Pennsylvania. And to this day, then, this herd has grown to nearly 1,000 animals, to the point that the Game Commission's been able to open hunting on elk, but elk viewing as a centerpiece of the Pennsylvania Wilds experience. Again, a lot of people come and enjoy Pennsylvania Wilds for everything from dark skies to the parks, to the viewing centers, to all these great amenities there. But the thing that people really hope to see is a view of a wild elk. So it's very threatening to the recreation economy and very threatening to the tourism economy in the Pennsylvania wilds. The cornerstone gem of the elk viewing, of course, is the Elk Country Visitors Center. And you'll be hearing from Keystone Elk Country Alliance is our partner there. It's a state park site, but the elk viewing in the Keystone Conservation Center we view as a landmark to pull people in and tell them not only the story of elk, but the story of conservation, to really open their eyes to the outdoors and to really encourage them to get out and explore Pennsylvania wilds and beyond. Open their eyes to this majestic animal and the story, the great conservation story that it tells. So a threat to the elk herd is a threat to conservation in our view. A threat to conservation is a threat to our tourism, our economy. So we view this very, very seriously. Just to give you a few statistics, in the first 5 years of being open, the Elk Center welcomed more than 1.6 million visitors. And this is, the tourism in Elk County grew from 55 million annually to 69.3 million annually, a 26% increase in a short time frame. Just to give you a sense of how important this is to the economy of that local rural area that really needs this kind of economy. The Pennsylvania Wilds itself receives 326 million visitors annually. We're seeing an increasing number of out-of-country visitors coming into this very special area. The program's really working. It's bringing people in and teaching them the story of Pennsylvania and the story of our great conservation heritage. But again, the elk lies at the keystone of this great conservation story. So again, just in closing, We at DCNR will stand ready as requested to assist with our staff at State Forest and State Parks, assist with media and telling the story, anything we can do to really help head off this big concern. So we stand ready as a partner and look forward to assisting as needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. Andy Olson of the Keystone Elk Country Alliance.
Thank you, Travis. The Keystone Elk Country Alliance is a Pennsylvania-based 501c3 wildlife conservation organization. The Alliance operates and manages the Elk Country Visitor Center in Benezet in cooperation with the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. KECA receives no operational dollars from the Commonwealth to manage and operate the Elk Center. Between 350,000 and 400,000 guests visit the Elk Center annually. Since opening the Elk Center in September 2010, over 2 million guests have visited the Elk Center, which includes all 50 states and 45 different countries. Elk watching and nature tourism drives economic development in the region. The Elk Country Visitor Center is a world-class destination that not only attracts visitors, but also drives foot traffic to many businesses in the region. Food, transportation, and lodging are the major businesses positively impacted. Businesses have grown substantially during the last 10 years, and especially since the Elk Center opened in 2010. This is a good example of real grassroots economic development. Dollars spent in the area to purchase products and services from the local artisans, eateries, wineries, etc. is certainly improving the economic base of the local and regional economies. These same entrepreneurs are working together on advertising, promotions, and special events to ensure that visitors experience all that Pennsylvania's Elk Country has to offer, as well as making their trip a memorable one. The Keystone Elk Country Alliance has educated over 350,000 individuals about wildlife conservation in structured educational programs. And we have enhanced and permanently protected over 2,500 acres of wildlife habitat since 2010. We currently conduct 13 key fundraising events across the state, which in turn put all money right back on the ground in Pennsylvania's Elk Country. We have the resources and audiences to educate the public about wildlife diseases, such as chronic wasting disease, working cooperatively with the Pennsylvania Game Commission, and we plan to keep this as one of our focus topics. CWD is currently on the doorstep of Pennsylvania's Elk Range, a confirmed wild deer in Disease Management Area 3. CWD could be devastating to not only Pennsylvania's elk herd, but also could certainly negatively impact the nature-based tourism industry surrounding it. Tourists travel to Benezet to see elk, and if the herd is reduced by disease, culling, or increased hunting to reduce the spread of CWD, then fewer elk viewing opportunities will be available. It is anticipated that fewer elk viewing opportunities could result in fewer tourists. Some business models in the region are based on a per capita spending per visitor. So fewer visitors means less income for the businesses. The Elk Country Visitor Center is one example of this model. Elk watching and nature tourism in the region generates approximately $70 million in economic development. Deer and deer hunting dwarfs elk watching by comparison. Pennsylvania's deer hunting generates approximately $1.6 billion annually. There's a tremendous amount of money and lifestyle at risk. The Keystone Elk Country Alliance strongly encourages the legislator to work closely with both the Pennsylvania Game Commission and the Department of Agriculture to provide the funding and manpower required to reduce the impact of this disease.
Thank you, Andy. Now we have a presentation from Wildlife Management Director Wayne LaRush. Wayne?
I'm going to show you some slides and give you an idea of where things are in the landscape. and a little bit more about CWD. Of course, chronic wasting disease, we've mentioned before, it's always fatal. In the very end stages, animals are becoming emaciated. They lose body function. They fall down. It's a brain debilitating disease that causes them eventually to all die. So these are the two DMAs we have today. The large one at the bottom is DMA2, and you can see DMA3 up in the top left corner. And you see the red place marker up in DMA3. That's the location of the new positive. And you can see that it's approximately 35 miles in a straight line from the closest positive within DMA2. A lot of ridges and valleys in between. We have no suspicion that it moved its way up from there. So, and this is where the elk range is. You see the elk range is borders on DMA3. And in fact, the new positive case is 10 miles in a straight line from its location to the border of the elk range. So this is a closer area. You can see the spot is about a 75 square mile area, and the red dots around the outside are locations where we've taken roadkill samples. And you can see we don't have much sample density within that area. In fact, Bell Township is the township in which this animal was taken. It's roughly 50 square miles in area, and last year we only had 600 harvested deer from that area, and we didn't know the exact locations. So some of the things that we'll be doing this year as we deploy those DMAP permits, we'll also want to get locations from hunters where they take the deer that we test, even the ones that test negative, because we need to know on that landscape where the negative ones are as well as the positive for us to be able to determine if there's a focal point where there are diseased deer that we might be able to target and do something about, rather than cast a broad net that's not going to be terribly efficient. So characteristics of CWD is always fatal. There's no pharmaceutical treatments that exist. There's no vaccines. It's a disease that originated in the early 60s out in Colorado State University deer pens was the first place where it showed up, and they were trading deer in and out to the wild. It's believed to get in the wild first there. And deer contracted a couple different ways. Animal-to-animal transmission is by far the greatest transmission mechanism at first. The saliva, urine, feces all pass prions out. And given that the animals are quite social, they're licking each other, and also there's many opportunities for the disease to be transmitted from animal to animal. Environment to animal transition is also possible, and the problem is that these prions can persist on the landscape for at least 15 years and remain infectious. So the greater the environmental load becomes, then the greater the probability that transmission will also occur from the environment to the animal. And in all cases, it appears that the disease has a progression that increases exponentially through time. And I argue CWD rides in the back of the truck. When it runs long distances, it's one thing when it's growing like a cancer on the landscape, but when it leaps from place to place, the mechanisms are usually human involved. It's right in the back of the truck. Whether it's high-risk parts, whether it's movement of live cervids, whether it's urine or other products or feed, and any of the methods that would be likely to transmit it or move it, are probably mainly human-induced. Now, just to give you a perspective, back in 1967, see that little dot there in Colorado? That's the extent of CWD in 1967. Here's 1996. You see it has grown out there, and you see this little dot up in Canada. They don't have one in South Dakota, but the truth is that it's traced back, and they believe the entire infection up in Canada came from perhaps a single elk that was moved from a elk farm in South Dakota up to Canada. And from there, it made its way to South Korea. Increasing by 2000, really increasing by 2008. Now the little dots are cervid operations. The yellow ones were depopulated. The red ones at the time, at 2008, still had positive animals on those farms. Leaping across more, now you can see we got it in Pennsylvania. let's see, I'll back up one. It's not in Pennsylvania in 2008, but by 16, of course, we've got it in Pennsylvania. And so you can see how it's progressed. Now 217, with our red positives down there, we've got 3 positive cervid farms, and of course, we've got it now up in DMA 3. So this is what we showed as of last year. At the end of 2016, we had 25 additional positives in 2016. That more than doubled the cumulative number of positives in the previous 4 years from the time we acquired the disease, which suggests a similar pattern that's been seen in other states where the disease tends to increase exponentially. I'll give you an example for DMA3, or DMA2 now. We got DMA, our first cases of CWD and DMA2 occurred in 2012. And there were 3 cases that year. You see the 3 dots. And then 2013, a few more filled in. We created the DMA2 at that time, and you see it was small. 2014, it got a little bigger. 2015, bigger, more cases. 2016, and now this is what it looks like now. In the past, since the 1st of January, we've gotten 9 more cases, and actually of those 9, 4 of them came in last night. Justin told me about those being confirmed last night. So we have every reason to believe that we could be on the order of 50 cases, 40, 50 cases there this year by the time it's all sugared off. So the point being that everywhere it has always increased. Some would think that maybe it would burn itself out, but there's been no examples of that. The disease has a history of continuing to grow and increase in prevalence level through time. It doesn't diminish itself unless some action is taken. In Illinois is perhaps the main example we've been giving of where they've taken action and been able to limit the increase in prevalence level down around 1.5%, while Wisconsin, on the other hand, in their core area, have gone up close to 40% in the same duration of time. They both got it 2002, I believe. So we've got a big problem, and it's not going to be a problem that's going to solve itself. And if it's left untreated, it's only worse. The threat is real. The situation is potentially dire, because recent work out in Wyoming has suggested that there's now evidence that deer populations actually can be in jeopardy. There's a mule deer and a whitetail population out there that they are predicting that could be extinct in 40 years. So if that trajectory comes to fruition across the landscape, then we do have a serious threat to the future of deer hunting and wildlife management agencies. So what are our options? From the Game Commission's perspective, we only have a certain number of things that we have statutory authority to deal with, and those are we can ban the transport of high-risk parts, and we do that. Those DMAs, that you can't transport any high-risk parts out of there. We also have interstate transport bans from states that are positive. We can ban the use of deer urine products, and we've done that. Ban feeding and baiting, and those DMAs, feeding and baiting is banned. And then something that we have not done yet, we could implement targeted removal, and that's the technique that Illinois has used, and in some places, like Colorado may have used it on a smaller scale and may have had some success, but it seems like there's a couple of scientific papers that have believed that Illinois has demonstrated success using that method. And I'll show you in a little bit why it's likely to be effective. Now, hunter-harvest, and we need those hunters out there to help us, because they're haphazard on a landscape which approaches random, but they provide us a tool by which we can determine where the infection is on the landscape. They provide us a surveillance method that we wouldn't have if they weren't out there hunting. But hunter-harvest in and of itself has never proven effective as a control for disease, because think about it, it's taking it haphazardly, and if the disease is on the landscape in pockets rather than randomly in that population, then if you're taking it haphazardly, you're not going to affect the percentage of sick deer in the population by using a random method. So hunter harvest is critical, like I said, to our surveillance method because it provides us a means of targeting where our control efforts should be placed. So targeting groups of animals, of course, deer are social animals. They group up in family groups, they group up in buck groups, and they group up during the wintertime in groups that are either seeking shelter or cover. And so that's double-edged sword, that enhances the ability for the disease to move from animal to animal, but it also provides a mechanism by which we can locate and target and try to remove entire groups of deer under the understanding that where you find one positive, the probability of detecting additional positives is far greater than it would be if you just picked spots randomly across the landscape. So this is really the only tool that we have, the only known method that has demonstrated any success. So right at this point in time, there's no vaccines, and that might be a viable method if there were vaccines to work on it with, but we have nothing else right now that's indicated other than this method. And basically what happens is there is a theory called a rose petal hypothesis. You can see groups of deer associated, related groups of deer, and you would expect them to have a higher probability of having the disease and spread it amongst them. And if you look at the little black dots and you say, okay, those are hunter harvest, they're taking one from a group here and one from a group there. Again, if you can, you hit one of those groups, then you've identified a location that you could target to try to remove entire groups. So this is the only method that we think gives us any hope of trying to control or contain this or roll it back. So it would be surgical, and we're not talking shooting thousands of deer. If we go into a location where we were going to do this, hundreds of deer are likely, and if we picked spots, typically, we went out last winter with a FLIR camera, and we did do a targeted removal for surveillance purposes last year. There were 100 to 150 deer feeding in green fields. Most cases, you'd probably be on the order of, it could be 60, 70 deer. If we could remove groups like that, just our own capabilities would limit us to a certain number of those operations a year. So I'm guessing that it would be virtually beyond our capabilities right now to take more than 1,000 deer, test them, and deal with them in a year. So it's not as if when we shot 340,000 deer with hunters last year, legal harvest, we're not talking an effort that should have a big impact upon hunting opportunity of our hunters across the state. But think about it, it behooves us to make sure that we have as good hunting opportunities as we can for our hunters. That's where we obtain our revenues in large part. And we also need their support. And so trying to minimize the footprint of these operations so that they're as efficient and as effective as possible is probably the best way that we can sell this to our hunting public and to make sure that we actually get the job done. We're also going to be working with Penn State on a research project. We're going to begin down in DMA2. There are questions. If we start going in there and shooting deer, might we increase the dispersal of deer? That would increase the spread. So we're going to use GPS collars and all the electronic technologies we have today, as well as DNA testing, those sorts of things, to try to answer some of the questions to make sure that we're not causing other kinds of problems when we try to do control problems. And so we're going to have to learn as we go. We know we don't know everything. We know that as we move forward, we're going to have to adapt and use an adaptive management kind of process to have any hope of success in the long run. So thanks, that's my briefing.
Thanks, Wayne. We'll move on at this time to the question and answer session. Do we have questions in the audience here? Let me come to you with the microphone so we can hear it on the live stream.
Okay, my question is, you mentioned deer are social. Is it safe to assume that there are probably already other infected deer out there in this area?
Can you hear me? I've just got to make sure it's turned on. Is it on now? Can't tell. This one's on. I think that's a pretty high likelihood that there are. And that's why we would like to make sure that we increase our sample density in that area where those deer are. And with the 2 extra permits plus the regular permits, we are thinking about whether we put check stations there or whether we find other ways of contacting the hunters, because we need to know the location, at least within a mile of where a deer is taken, in order for us to determine something like that. So the answer is good likelihood that there are exposed animals.
In terms of the targeted shooting, you mentioned that that typically occurs in winter. Is that when you're looking to do that?
Right now, I don't want to rule out being able to shoot at other times of year, but given the time frame and the logistics and everything that we have, and from what our observations were last winter, right now that's what we're looking at for the short term at least. And that would be after hunting season's over.
Wayne, I had received a question by email also on the targeted removal, and I think that you answered most of it in your presentation there, but one part that maybe wasn't explained is the size of the tracks we'd be looking to shoot on.
We're not, I'm not looking at it in terms of the size of tracks. I'm looking at it, where are there groups of deer? And we know, we shot last winter, and I made some other observations with FLIR camera, that there'd be groups of 100 or 200 deer maybe going to green fields to feed, or maybe going to cover. So it's not a matter of the area so much as how do we get the deer how do we find the deer that are associated with each other while they're concentrated, because if they're concentrated, that'll make it more efficient for us to be able to get the deer. And if they're in the group that they normally associate with, then it's more likely, the probability should be higher that we're taking out the infected animals.
As far as the elk herd goes, I guess 2 parts. One, how might the disease transfer from deer to elk? And if it shows up in the elk herd, will you be looking to do targeted removal of elk as well?
I hope we don't have to get that far. Justin might be even better to answer the elk, but why don't you answer the elk part, Justin?
Well, I think the way it would show up there is essentially the same route of transmission that Wayne talked about, deer to deer. I think we'll know a little bit better in regards to the geographic distribution and other cases that may occur in the area after this year when we do added surveillance in that more focal area. But transmission would essentially be the same as far as mechanism. And I think we do have a fairly good history of sampling elk. Last year we were over 100 cases, which isn't bad considering the size of the population. Generally we sample 100% or near 100% of the hunter harvested animals that are over a year of age, and then we usually get a dozen or so what we'd call clinical suspects that are submitted to the diagnostic lab. So as far considering the size of our elk population, I feel like we do have fairly good surveillance on that group of animals. But I think in regards to targeted removal of elk, I think it's something that we're just going to have to see how this fall goes in regards to looking at the level of infection in that area and our continued monitoring of the elk herd.
And I concur, we're going to have to probably cross that bridge when we get to it.
Just one last question for me is in terms of, you mentioned it's going to be a costly effort. Do you have any idea what this is going to cost, and between DCNR and the Game Commission, who's going to pay how much? Or
We don't have good cost estimates yet. USDA Wildlife Services helped us last year, but they covered their own costs for that operation. And if we get into a larger operation where they require reimbursement, then I don't have yet an assessment of what those costs would be. And the rest, of course, would be our testing, some of which would fall under our, what we're doing already, but some of which would mean an extra effort. So we don't have good numbers yet, and it's the kind of thing that we probably have to have some experience doing it in order to whittle the numbers down fine and be better at predicting.
Can you tell me what specific signs this deer, this adult buck, exhibited when it was reported?
I don't have the exact specific signs, but it was in markedly poor body condition, and it was showing levels of sort of neurologic impairment, where it was just sort of more unaware of its surroundings and not quick to flee or anything like that. And so the animal was euthanized, and the entire carcass was submitted to the diagnostic lab for a full necropsy. And as part of our diagnostic workup, the CWD testing was performed on it, as is routine on all of our CWD suspects that are submitted as full carcasses to the lab.
Was it in a residential area, a wooded area? Was it easily seen by the public when it was reported?
It was actually on game lands. In that area, we actually own a large portion of that area, and this deer was taken in a remote area, relatively remote area, on game land 87.
The location of this deer, are there any captive deer facilities in this area as well?
This deer was taken approximately 8 miles in a straight line to the original farm that was depopulated, or one of the farms that was depopulated. There are a couple of other farms that I believe were quarantined that were about 4 miles away. And there could be other facilities that I'm not aware of right now. Maybe Department of Ag might be able to help. That might be closer, but I can't speak to that.
Yeah, to follow up on that, the two premises that were positive there in Jefferson County, that was probably 3.5, 4 years ago. They're 8 and 9 miles from that current location that Wayne identified.
It was mentioned that transportation is one possible way CWD spreads, transportation of deer. Are there any prohibitions or limits on deer being imported from other areas to deer farms in Pennsylvania? Is there anything that limits that?
No, just to explain that program, there's two in Pennsylvania. One is the HCP, the Herd Certified Program, and that's a USDA APHIS program that the Department of Ag, validates for them for the interstate movement of deer, across state lines. And the other one is a mandatory program if you're not in the voluntary HCP program, which is the Herd Monitored Program, the HMP, and we require anybody that would have deer to be in that program. So that's where all the testing and the surveillance, the record requirements is you have to keep the herd inventories, the movement documents of deer coming and going. So we're following USDA's, standards on that program. And then the voluntary, herd monitored program, again, we have those farmers enrolled in that. But I mean, we're looking at working with Game Commission. We've had a lot of discussions of how to be consistent, whether inside or outside the fence, things that are practical, public education, the sort of the uniformity. So if we have farmers that are in a certain DMA and there's a high risk parts ban, we'd be consistent with them as well, because when these deer are being transported after they're harvested, it's hard for game to identify whether that was one of theirs and, a wildlife species, or it was actually owned by, a hunting preserve or harvested by a private person on one of those operations as well. So those are some of the smaller things that we're tightening down to be uniform and consistent.
So there's nothing to stop a deer farm from importing another animal from a farm that is not certified?
Well, they have to be in the same herd status of a certified operation to buy into another certified herd. But in that area, if there's, they're monitored herds, they'd have to, buy between themselves as well.
So maybe if I could just clarify a little bit here, with the federal program, it's a 5-year program where you have to test 100% of the deaths in your herd for 5 years. And after that, then you're considered fully certified and you can move across state lines as long as you continue to meet that testing requirement and CWD is not detected in your herd.
Is that absolute? Because the only way to test is on a dead animal. So is it possible that there could be active CWD animals on a deer farm that you wouldn't know and they could be moved?
it is unlikely. What we end up doing, if you think about it in Pennsylvania, with our certified herds, they tend to be breeding herds, so they tend to sell genetic stock to the herd monitor programs, which Greg was talking about, which tends to be more hunting preserves and smaller operations. Those hunting preserves are held to a 50% testing requirement. So every 1 out of 2 deer on those hunting preserves gets tested. So between the certified programs having to test 100% of their deaths, and then correspondingly, as those deer move off to the hunting preserves and 50% of those deer getting tested, we feel we have fairly good surveillance. Although, one thing that we've been discussing and have presented to the deer farmers is Dr. Wolfgang and are looking to move, in addition to just having a 100% testing requirement on deaths, to say there'll be a percentage of your herd inventory that must be tested annually. In the past year, our herd inventory is around 23,000 in Pennsylvania. We tested a little over 3,000 deer, which in the grand scheme is fairly good surveillance as opposed to a huge wild population where you can test maybe 6,000 deer. So we realize the risks, and we are really trying to work with our herds. Certainly age, I think we would all agree, is a factor. So we're trying to educate our deer farmers to have the best genetics. So in the 1 to 2 year bucks, they can have these 250, 300, 350 point bucks, so that they're not keeping those deer around. Because the longer they're around for, I think the more risk they pose to the herd and to the environment.
Yeah, and just to be clear on that, we're following the federal standards on that. We don't make up these, guidelines and requirements. So we're following USDA APHIS requirements for that program.
And deer lure was also mentioned. Is there any thought from the Game Commission about implementing a ban on deer urine outside of the DMAs?
We have been discussing it. I mean, we do have a number of actions in addition that we have the authority and the ability to do. We have been discussing that with the commission.
And the last question from me, do you know what size deer population you're potentially dealing with in Bell Township in this area? Is it high, low?
We went up with a FLIR camera a couple weeks ago and just did a very spot check, minimum count kind of thing. Of course, the grass is high. We saw quite a lot of does that the fawns were not accompanying those does yet we saw a lot of deer. So, I would have to guess, but my guess is pretty substantial deer herd. We saw a lot of deer.
During the hunting season, if a hunter encounters a deer that exhibits these sorts of tendencies, what should that hunter do at that time?
Could you repeat the question for me? I didn't quite hear you.
During the deer hunting season,
Yeah.
if a hunter encounters a deer that is exhibiting some of the CWD tendencies, what should that hunter do at that time?
The hunter should call the regional office and talk to dispatch and give them the location of that animal, and they'll send out a WCO that will dispatch the deer and have it tested. Now, if you shoot a deer, if a hunter harvests a deer that he believes is diseased in any way, that's sick or diseased, he should do the same thing. Call the office, call the regional office, have a WCO go out there. And that WCO will take that deer and for testing, and they will give that hunter another tag. They'll replace the tag so they can go back out and shoot another deer.
It seems to me as though if you just report it, that deer would wander away and may not be recoverable. Would it be better just to shoot that deer if you think it may be diseased?
Well, Rich, would you like to answer that? Sure.
We would not advise that at this time because there's no exception under the game code for anyone other than certain officers to go ahead and dispatch animals. But if the reporting is quick enough, this is a priority enough for us that we will get an officer there as soon as absolutely possible.
I do have some questions that were sent to me by email. And then after we get through these questions, I will ask the panel to just stay seated in case any others come in by email or text. This second question, and we picked up part of the sharpshooter questions. These all come from the same outdoor writer. And this one's probably more appropriate for you, Justin. He's asking about the states bordering Pennsylvania and their CWD response, and I'll go ahead and read it. Given that CWD was detected in virtually all states bordering Pennsylvania before it was first detected here, how is the spread and overall areas affected in our border states, specifically Maryland, West Virginia, Ohio, and New York, compared to what we are experiencing here in Pennsylvania?
So the question in regards to CWD in surrounding states, currently states that have it, that are positive in free-ranging cervids would certainly be Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia. It was first introduced into this region in 2005 in West Virginia, and it started to make sort of an expansal spread outward into Virginia, into Maryland, and obviously we became positive in 2012, both in captive as well as free-ranging deer. New York also was positive in 2005, and they're one of the rare success stories in CWD, in that it appears that they were aggressive in their response, and it has been eradicated. At least they've had no positives since that time. Ohio has had it in a captive operation in more of the eastern part of the state. In regards to surveillance and management, most of our surrounding states, with a few exceptions, do have some of the similar regulations that we have in regards to their areas where they manage CWD. There is some variation in regards to the level and way that we conduct surveillance, but certainly, and we have an annual meeting every year where the biologists and veterinarians get together and share these updates with each other, and certainly we do it more frequently than that through email and phone throughout the year. But certainly Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, they regularly get positives every year, and at a fairly high level in some areas, particularly in the focal area of West Virginia. So other than that, is there another part to the question?
No, I think that's a adequate answer. And there's one more question here too, and Wayne, this is probably best for you, and this speaks to the difficulty of containing the disease, of controlling the disease in your response, and it reads, "It seems apparent that despite our best efforts for containment, the rate of infection of CWD has and will continue to increase, and CWD has and will continue to spread into more areas, most likely at an ever-increasing pace. At what point do we abandon the strategy of more and bigger DMAs and employ the strategy of managing, if that is possible, a deer herd that is to some degree overall infected with CWD?"
I'll start out by saying very simply, if you don't think you can, you won't. And you simply are not going to put the effort in if you don't think you can solve a problem. So right off the bat, we have a defeatist attitude if we don't think that we can do anything about this. Illinois has demonstrated some appearance of success there, so it does not seem as if it's necessarily an impossible task. The issue is, how hard do we fight? Because if we're going to contaminate the landscape with prions capable of lasting for long durations of time on the landscape, and with a demonstrated propensity to leap species barriers, at what point in time do we become really fearful of what the results may be? So my argument is that we have a chance, especially up in DMA3, we got one positive. New York blinked it out, seems, they stamped out an initial infection. We should have a similar opportunity to what they had in New York. So I think we need to be aggressive, and that we need to think out of the box. We need to proceed trying to put things in place, make sure that we put the proper science in place so we can determine what works, what doesn't work, how we can be successful, and be willing to adapt and change as we move forward through time so that we can become better at trying to control it. So I'm not going to believe that it's inevitable and that that the world's going to come to the end. I'm going to believe that if we apply ourselves, then maybe we can find a solution.
I do have 2 additional questions electronically. One is probably best for you, Brian, but how much more money will the Game Commission be investing in Disease Management Area 3?
I think one answer to that is whatever it takes to get this job done. You know, Wayne had mentioned earlier, we don't know exactly how much. We're currently investing about $1 million annually. I wouldn't be surprised if that doubles with the current activities that we're proposing and the research that we're going to be getting on the ground. Our outlook is, you know, it's not only the future of deer hunting, it's the future of wildlife management in the Commonwealth that's at stake here. And we've got to aggressively go after this with everything we have.
Second question, other states have tried controlled burns to get rid of CWD. Have you considered trying this in PA? Wayne?
Actually, that idea has just surfaced recently. Again, I'm willing to think out of the box. Some of the problems with that are that it takes a very high temperature, like 1100 degrees Fahrenheit, in order to destroy, you don't kill it, it's not a living organism, to destroy prions. And so you can imagine on a fire, yes, fires get hotter than that, but usually when you've got a burn on a landscape, you may have variability in the temperatures as it goes across that landscape. So potential there would be for prions to be sent up into the atmosphere and spread around in that way. Of course, then the question is, would they be dilute enough such that they didn't cause any new infections? We don't know. So I think it's a good thing to think about and maybe to experiment with, but it also brings up some other potential problems and questions that need to be addressed before anybody went on a wild burning campaign.
Are there any additional questions in the audience?
You had mentioned in this area there was a deer farm that was depopulated due to CWD on that farm, 8 or 9 miles away from this location. Do you know if has been any deer that have escaped from this farm into the wild? That has to be reported, I believe.
Yeah, they have to report that immediately within, we give them 24 hours to notify us, but I have no record of any escapes off of those farms.
Any additional questions in the audience? Any additional statements by the panel?
I think just in closing, this is a serious issue. And to go back to what we mentioned earlier by many of the individuals here today is we really need the help of our citizens, our hunters, and the legislative support to get this job done. If we don't get that support, this effort could fail. And we certainly don't want this to be a chapter in the history books that's read 100 years from now that said, boy, I wish we would have done more. Now's the time to put all our efforts to get this job done, and we're going to need that support.
With that, we'll adjourn for the day, and thank you for attending, thank you for viewing, and thank you for your interest in this pressing measure.